You're looking at San Francisco's City Hall, the site of one of the most shocking events in the history of this city. Welcome back, everyone. My name's Robert, and today I'm going to give you a little tour inside San Francisco City Hall, and I'm going to discuss one of the most shocking and sad events that has ever occurred in this city, or even in this country. And that event occurred on November 27th, 1978, when the mayor of this city, George Moscone, and a member of the Board of Supervisors, and not just any member of the Board of Supervisors, one of the most prominent politicians in the entire country, because he was the first openly gay man to be elected to anything in this country. His name was Harvey Milk. On that day in 1978, George Moscone and Harvey Milk were brutally murdered, brutally assassinated inside City Hall. And if that's not shocking enough, those events led to probably the biggest miscarriage of justice that this country's ever seen. Let's go inside and I'll continue the story. As you see the magnificent edifice of City Hall, this building is truly remarkable. The dome is actually taller than the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And the ornateness of this building is untouchable. So we'll go inside and tour around, and I'll show you, and I'll talk a little bit more about that fateful day and the events leading up to it. As you can see, there is security here, and it's a beautiful atrium with gorgeous bronze busts. You'll see those all throughout the building. So I will go through security now and see you on the other side. So we have made it through security into the gorgeous atrium of City Hall. As you can see, they have a beautiful Christmas tree set up. And I'll let you see the ornateness of this building. It is truly magnificent. So to return to our story, who was Harvey Milk? Harvey Milk was a prominent politician, a prominent gay rights activist here in the city. He was openly gay. He was, and he was an activist who was involved not just in gay rights, but also various other progressive issues. And he ran a couple times for Board of Supervisors, but didn't succeed. But then in 1977, on his third try, he was elected. And we have a bronze bust of him here. And says this is the famous Harvey Milk. Like I said before, the first openly gay man to be elected to any position here in the United States. Born on May 22nd, 1930, and died fatefully on November 27th, 1978. And so in the election of November 1977, the Board of Supervisors elected Harvey Milk, or Harvey Milk was elected to the Board of Supervisors George Moscone won the mayoralty. And there was another man by the name of Dan White, who was also elected that day to the Board of Supervisors. Now, Dan White was a former Army soldier in Vietnam, and he was a former police officer here in San Francisco, but he quit the force. No one's really sure exactly why Dan White quit the force, but what I read was he witnessed one of his fellow police officers beating up someone who was handcuffed, which is very illegal, very unethical, very wrong. And he was so appalled by that that he quit the force. Now, I don't know if he reported that person or what happened, but that's what I read why he quit the San Francisco Police Department. And then after that, he got a job as a firefighter here in the city. And so he ran for Board of Supervisors. He won. Harvey Milk won, and a whole bunch of people came in November of 1977. There was a bunch of new blood in the Board of Supervisors. A bunch of new people were elected. And so it was kind of an exciting time in the city. Now, Dan White, he wasn't... I wouldn't say he was... He made a few controversial statements about sort of the derelicts of the city. I don't think he was necessarily anti-gay, but I don't think he was necessarily an advocate or, pro-gay necessarily. But I don't think that was the reason why him and Harvey Milk didn't get along. As we see the bronze bust of George Moscone, okay, the mayor, who was also murdered that day with Harvey Milk, born in 1929. He also served as a state senator, and he was a victim that day as well. Of course, we have Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein took over, actually, the mayor after George Moscone was killed. And in fact, she was in the room, outside the room when he was killed, and actually ran to him and found his body after Dan White killed him here in City Hall. And she was the one who announced it to the press that Harvey Milk and Dan White were killed. As we see Gavin Newsom, who's the current governor of California and was the mayor here of the city, as well as Willie Brown, who was also prominent back in those days in the 70s here in California. And so Dan White and Harvey Milk, they didn't really get along. They had some political disagreements. Harvey Milk wanted Dan White to vote for a specific ordinance, which would be like sort of a pro-gay ordinance here in the city. And Dan White was on board with voting for that as long as Harvey Milk would vote for a particular bill that he was championing, which is to remove a psychiatric center from his district. It's like a psychiatric center in the district of Dan White's, and he wanted it gone because it attracts the wrong kind of people, he said. So he kind of made a deal with Harvey Milk to, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's kind of what politicians do, right? Harvey Milk didn't go along with it, though. He did not vote to remove that psychiatric center. And so Dan White didn't vote for his ordinance, but it still passed. And so that caused some friction between them. Most of the facts I'm getting about Harvey Milk today I read from the internet, and I also got from a movie called Milk, starring Sean Penn. And so I don't know, movies can sometimes skew the facts, so I'm just going by what I saw in that movie. And so, if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. So Harvey Milk and Dan White, they had their issues. Another issue was Dan White wanted a raise. He felt like the Board of Supervisors, they just didn't make enough money. Their salary was just over $9,000 at the time. And basically, that wasn't enough for him to raise a family. And so he asked Harvey to support a bill to increase the salaries of the Board of Supervisors, and Harvey Milk said no to that as well. So he wasn't really playing ball, as most politicians do. And so Dan White was very agitated about this, and he quit the Board of Supervisors. Dan White quit the Board of Supervisors. He said, I can't afford to live on this salary anymore. I'm gone. He wrote a letter to George Moscone, the mayor, and he said, I'm out. But the next day, he changed his mind. Apparently, the police association, the police union, they had a meeting with Dan White and other because he was a former cop. So the police association, they supported Dan White, And basically, they convinced him to stay in as a board of supervisor. They said that they would help him out financially with loans and whatnot. And so he was like, all right, I'll stay. So he told George Moscone, hey, I changed my mind, rip up that resignation letter, I'm staying. But Moscone wouldn't play ball. Moscone and Harvey Milk did not want Dan White back on the Board of Supervisors. And in fact, from the movie that I saw, Harvey Milk actually threatened George Moscone. He said, George, you're not going to have the gay vote if you reinstate Dan White. In the next election, you're not going to have our support, and you won't win the next election. So we don't, unless if you put Dan White back on the board. And so Moscone said, all right, he basically had to acquiesce to Harvey Milk's threats for fear of losing his position in the future. And so Dan White got extremely angry about this. And as we see a nice picture of Harvey White right there. Of Harvey Milk. Sorry, Harvey Milk. Now, and so Dan White got very angry about this. And I don't know if it was the next day or a couple days, the day after. I don't know exactly. It was on November 27th, 1978. He was no longer a member of the Board of Supervisors, but he broke into City Hall. Now, when I say break in, White climbed through a window in City Hall. Now, earlier you saw that there's metal detectors and there's security at the entrance of City Hall. And even in 1978, they had that. They had security and metal detectors in City Hall. So you couldn't bring a gun in here, right? So Dan White had to sneak in through a window in order to get in here with his gun. And he had not just a loaded gun, but 10 rounds of ammunition with him. And you might ask, even in 1978, they had such high security. And the reason for that is because of a group called the National Liberation Front, which was a domestic terrorist group that was wreaking havoc across Northern California with bombings and threats and kidnappings, and they were threatening politicians. And so the whole area here, the Bay Area, was in fear, right? They were in fear. And so many of the politicians were being threatened, and so they had to have high security here at City Hall. Now, Dan White, he snuck into City Hall that day, okay? As we see a lovely couple here who had just gotten married, having their wedding pictures at this beautiful, beautiful, picturesque place here. San Francisco's magnificent City Hall. And so Dan White snuck in and he went right up to George Moscone's office and he said, come with me. And he said, I want my job back. I want you to reinstate me as the Board of Supervisors. Moscone was like, I can't do it. He's like, let's go over to the lounge here and have a drink and chat, but I can't do it. So they went over to the lounge beside Moscone's office. And as George, the mayor, was pouring... Sorry, let me just... And as the mayor was pouring out 2 cups of whiskey for him and Dan to drink, Dan pulled out a gun and he shot Moscone. Not just once, but he shot him 4 times. And then when Moscone was on the ground, basically dying, Dan White went right up to him and put 2 bullets right in his head, execution style, like as though he was killing a deer. And he did the exact same thing to Harvey Milk. Shot him 4 or 5 times, and when Harvey was on his knees, Dan White shot him right in the temple, execution style. And this happened right here in the mayor's office. The current mayor is London Breed. Let's see if I can show you inside the mayor's office. I don't know if I'm allowed, but... Hello. I was just wondering, I'm making a video about Harvey Milk and George Moscone. I was wondering if I could show the room where George Moscone was murdered.
I don't think that's accessible right now.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. So So I can't show you the room where George Moscone was murdered, unfortunately. But it was a little lounge right beside the mayor's office. And the room I walked into isn't the mayor's office per se, that's just the waiting room. She has a massive office back there that's like down a huge hallway, so. Now, Harvey Milk was murdered in the Board of Supervisors office, so let's see if that's accessible. Actually, Dan White pulled Harvey Milk into Dan White's former supervisor's office, and that's where he murdered him. This is the current Board of Supervisors here, I believe. Board of Supervisors go-to room, 244, maybe that's it? Let's have a look. I'm not certainly extremely familiar with the layout of this gigantic building. Okay, so these are Board of Supervisors. Hello, sir.
Hello.
Do you work in City Hall?
I do.
I have a question for you. Do you happen to know the room, which office poor Harvey Milk was murdered in? Because I'm doing a video of Harvey Milk and Moscone's assassination.
I mean, the offices are all different now from they were when they were around.
Gotcha.
I represent the neighborhoods that Milk represented, but
You
it's
did?
a different number district. I'm District 8, he was District 5, but I represent the Castro.
Okay. And what's your name, sir?
Raphael.
Raphael. Oh, I've heard of your name. Yep, Raphael Mandel.
So I think all of them were in a much smaller, more crowded kind of situation. I think all along this wall, along this side.
So basically, it was somewhere in here where it happened. And Moscone was in the mayor's office, right?
There's office over there.
Okay. Thank you. Hi.
Hello.
I'm making a video on Harvey Milk, and I was wondering, he was murdered in one of these rooms. Do you know which room it was?
I don't know. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
okay. Can I explore?
Sure. This is Supervisor Melgar's office.
Melgar's
We're,
office.
Moving right now. So
Oh, yes, because there's a transition period, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Did Supervisor Melgar get reelected?
Yes, she did.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic
I think they've
devices.
probably renovated these rooms a lot since '78, right? When Harvey Milk was assassinated?
I'm guessing so.
Okay. But do you know much about where Harvey Milk was murdered back in 1978 here in this building? No. I'm just doing a little video on him and Moscone's assassination.
You should definitely ask there's a docent that does tours downstairs.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Thank you. And so, poor Harvey Milk and George Moscone were murdered in cold blood. Now, previously I said that it was, at the beginning of this video, I said that it was one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice that this country's ever seen. Now, what do I mean it was a miscarriage of justice? Because, okay, and this is unbelievable. Dan White, after he murdered Moscone and Milk, He took the keys to a secretary's car and just drove home, and nobody arrested him. The cops didn't even follow him. Not even that night did anyone go to his house and arrested him, even though everyone knew he did it. Okay? It wasn't until the next day that he turned himself in. So he was never even arrested. He turned himself in for the murders. Okay? And now, the biggest miscarriage of justice that is almost, that, except for maybe OJ's verdict, okay? Dan White, if you can believe this, only went to jail for 5 years. Dan White went to jail for 5 years for brutally murdering 2 of San Francisco's most prominent men. 2 of the leaders of this city were assassinated, and he went to jail for 5 years because the prosecutor plea bargained it down to voluntary manslaughter. No murder, no first degree, no second degree, voluntary manslaughter. And the city absolutely erupted. Okay, they had the White Nights riots. The gay community was absolutely shocked, completely stunned at such a unfortunate turn of events. To have a brutal killer get out of jail in 5 years. And the worst part is, when he got out of jail in 1984, he even admitted to a cop that the murders were premeditated and he wanted to kill 2 more counselors. He actually had 4 on his list. He wanted to kill 2 more, but he didn't get around to it. I don't know what happened, but he didn't do it. And so that was by far the most brutal, like one of the most egregious things that's ever happened in this country, how they just let him off with 5 years. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he should have faced a firing squad. Now, I guess the silver lining is about a year after he got out of jail, he made his way to San Francisco and he committed suicide. Dan White committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. So at least he didn't get to live a long life after he was out of jail. So I guess that's kind of a silver lining, but it is one of the most horrifying events that's ever occurred, and the travesty of justice that happened just sent this city into complete anger and dismay. And so this was one of the most shocking events that's ever occurred, not just here in San Francisco, but in the United States. And this was a time in San Francisco when a lot of things were going on, a lot of bad things were going on. Previously I mentioned the National Liberation Front that was causing all kinds of havoc throughout the city. And then there was something called the People's Temple, which was the cult run by Jim Jones. I think probably many of you have heard of the cult run by Jim Jones, known as the People's Temple, which committed a mass suicide in Guyana in 1978. Well, a lot of people aren't aware that Jim Jones had very strong ties to the Bay Area, and almost all the people that died in that mass suicide in Guyana were from San Francisco. And in fact, Mayor Moscone had some connections to Jim Jones as well. So Jim Jones had supported Mayor Moscone's mayoralty. So there was a lot going on in that year here in San Francisco. It was a crazy year. And the assassinations of Milk and Moscone were sort of just the tipping point, one might say. And so each of the members of the Board of Supervisors, they all have their own offices here in this hallway, it looks like. Dean Preston. let's head back outside City Hall. We have a beautiful bronze bust of Adolf Sutro. And another one of Michael O'Shaughnessy, San Francisco city engineer. So as you can see, this building is truly remarkable. And unfortunately was was the place of one of the saddest events here in the city back in 1978. But I just wanted to give my viewers here today a little history time story of what happened here in 1978. One of the most shocking and sad events that's ever happened in this city, but it's part of our history, and so I wanted to go over it, and I want to show you inside the beautiful City Hall. So thank you for joining me, everyone. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Please remember to like and subscribe, hit those notifications, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, everyone.